Well, welcome everyone. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about handling conflict in the workplace. So it's something that I think all of us deal with from time to time at our jobs, and it's something that I think at times can be very stressful because we're not really sure how to handle it if it doesn't go smoothly. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, give you guys some skills on how to manage some of these things in the future and discussing like how to improve communication between colleagues, between supervisors and employees, employees and supervisors, etc. And so basically, all right, let me see if it will. There we go. Okay. So basically, for the agenda, so we're going to talk a little bit about the causes of workplace conflict, some of the consequences associated with it, not just for the individuals in the conflict, but also the consequences for the department or for the university as a whole if workplace conflict is more frequent. We're going to be talking about the benefits of healthy communication during conflict, the different types of conflict, both healthy and unhealthy. We're going to talk a little bit about microaggressions and some of the harm that they can cause if they're present in communication. And we're also going to be talking about how to communicate specifically with people that are neurodivergent and how we can provide feedback to employees that we supervise and how we can provide effective feedback to our supervisors if we're feeling like we're kind of struggling with that workplace dynamic. And then finally, we're also going to be talking about some different coping tools to kind of help us work through difficult conversations and take effective breaks from conversations that are leaning towards being more unhealthy. Okay. Okay. So workplace conflict, I would say, would be any form of disagreement or oppositions between employees and supervisors based off of different beliefs, ways of doing things, or even kind of just personalities and differences that those may hold. Okay, so there's a lot of different causes that we can get for workplace conflict, and these are going to be some of the main ones that research has shown to be some of the more common ones that we see in all different types of workplaces. So one of the top ones here that we see is unclear communication and expectations of employees and supervisors. So a lot of the time, this can happen because we're all different people with our own upbringings, our own belief systems, our own ways of doing things. And so when we all get together and we try to navigate the work environment, it's all not always going to be clear, I think, what the other person is talking about. Sometimes there will be misunderstandings. Sometimes there will be people learn in different ways. And so a lot of times when we do see conflict in the workplace, often it can come from unclear communication and unclear expectations. And so what this would look like would be is like, let's say you're a supervisor that is very straight and to the point and doesn't kind of mince words. You don't like you say, this is what I want, let's get this done. That's it. Or let's say you're a supervisor that maybe talks with a little bit more examples or metaphors or things like that. You may have employees that don't really understand that form of communication, and as a result, may make some mistakes and may get confused on what you're asking them to do. And so I think a lot of the times that can be one of the main causes of conflict and butting heads in the workplace is because one person's saying they want one thing done, and the other person is interpreting it very differently than that original person is intending. And so that's one of our first causes. And then the next cause is differing opinions on how tasks should be completed. So a lot of times I like to give a non-workplace example for this particular cause, and that's a driving example. So we've all been in the car with someone where we have one particular route we like to take to get to, say, like, let's say the grocery store, the route that we feel like is most efficient, the route that we feel like takes the shortest amount of time. And we see the driver at that time maybe taking a roundabout way or taking a way that we feel like is 2 or 3 minutes longer. And sometimes we bring that up, sometimes we don't. And generally, when we bring that up, maybe the response we get from the person is, yeah, I know that other way is probably a little bit quicker, but I like this way as well due to A, B, and C reason. And so we may not understand it, but that's kind of like the way they do things. And I think at the end of the day, the differing in opinions can cause conflict because one person doesn't understand why the other person's doing things the way that they're doing. Even though that person may have a totally valid reason behind why they're doing things in the particular way that they're doing, right? And so next cause of workplace conflict is discrimination based off of gender, race, sexual orientation, etc. And we're going to go more into this when we talk about microaggressions in some of the later slides, but this can also be a cause for workplace conflict that we see in different environments. And so next one is going to be unhealthy office politics. So this is something that we'll generally see in forms of like workplaces that I think are very high achieving and individuals inside the workplace that are also very high achieving. So it can be very easy to feel like we're kind of trying to win the race to the top, so to speak. We're trying to get that promotion, we're trying to get that raise, but sometimes depending on the work environment, it can feel like it's kind of at the expense of the people around us rather than all of us kind of working together as a team to be able to achieve common goals. And unfortunately, sometimes in different office environments, sometimes the supervisor of that environment may consciously or unconsciously promote that through kind of favoritism sometimes. And so next one, and I think these last two go hand in hand, is going to be a poor emotional regulation of employees or supervisors or problems outside of the workplace that they can bring with them. And so a lot of the time, let's say you're having a bad day. And let's say going with this original one, poor emotional regulation in the workplace, let's say you're feeling behind on work. You had some interactions in the office that went poorly because somebody was upset, etc. And you're on edge. And then maybe somebody comes up to you and maybe not in the best way possible, tries to give you feedback, and maybe you lose your cool on them. And so basically, when that happens, that other person's defensive walls immediately go up, and then that creates further conflict down the road. And so the next section of this is outside forces coming in to cause emotional regulation issues. So things like let's say you're going through a divorce, or you had a pet that just died, or you're having some financial troubles, things like that. And it feels very challenging to be able to work through them at home. And so maybe some of these emotions come into the workplace and make it so you maybe have a little bit of a shorter fuse for stressful situations in the workplace than you might normally, given other situations. And so these are just some of the main different causes that we'll see for conflict. There definitely are others, but these are some of the more common ones that we'll see. Okay, so consequences of unhealthy communication. So some of these are pretty self-explanatory, but I think they are worth mentioning because I think it kind of shows the importance of having healthier communication in the workplace. And so the first thing that we notice is workplace disruptions. In the more severe cases, this can look very obvious of like two individuals yelling at each other, lobbing insults, things like that, that disrupts not only their work environment, but it disrupts everybody around them, especially if there's kind of more of an open floor plan where people are in cubicles rather than their own individual offices. And so that's part of the workplace disruption, but another section of it that's maybe not so obvious is because of the fact that there is unhealthy communication. Maybe we're spending more time than normal on these different forms of communication. It's taking away from our ability to get work done in the way that we would like to, dedicating the amount of time that we want to get work done. And by association, some of the people that are nearby in the office may also struggle to kind of get some of their own work done too, because sometimes they're kind of drawn into that as well, right? And so that's one of our first consequences here. And then we have decreased productivity. And so this is the next step that I was mentioning earlier with workplace disruptions. If we're spending more time trying to dispute conflict in an unhealthy fashion, then generally we're not going to be spending as much time kind of doing the things that we want to be doing for work or that we need to be doing for work, because we're dedicating more of that time to not just kind of resolving the conflict, but resolving the high emotional state that resulted from that conflict. And so then the next one is going to be increased absences. And so generally, this can be due to physical illness sometimes, like we've all heard the conversation about like the higher our stress levels, the more likely we are to get sick. And so that can be one thing that can happen where if we're in a workplace where unhealthy conflict is more frequent or more intense, some of those stress levels will leak over into us catching a cold or us kind of struggling to be able to do some of the things that we would normally end up doing if there wasn't so much conflict in the workplace. And so that's part of it. And then the other part is mental health issues that can cause the increased absences as well. None of us like frequent conflict, especially if it's of the unhealthy variety. And so a lot of times what we'll see from that is there's a lot higher anxiety for a lot of people to go into that workplace to interact with the person or people that they're having conflict with. And so as a result, maybe they take a mental health day, or maybe they are feeling so depressed to kind of have to continue to go into that situation that they just can't pull themselves out of bed. And so a lot of times we will see that. And I think the two can sometimes even go hand in hand, physical and mental. Like mental health can create physical issues, such as we can get headaches, like stress headaches from high levels of stress. We can have stomach aches, or I've known people to even throw up due to increased levels of stress. So there's a lot of overlap there with that kind of stuff. And so then lastly, there's more increased turnover and frequent terminations from a high conflict workplace. And this is due to people not wanting to stay in that job long term because they don't like feeling that level of stress. And so they end up leaving to find other places of employment that are hopefully better. Sometimes that can lead to people being terminated because they lose their cool and they say something that they probably shouldn't, or the conflict has just gotten to the point where it just can't be resolved. And that also leads to kind of the person leaving or the person being fired. Okay. Okay, so I'm sure you guys had the question while I was talking about this, like, okay, what's the difference between healthy versus unhealthy conflict? How can I tell if I'm having a healthy disagreement or one that's going to lead to the worsening of the conflict down the road? And so the main difference here would be, when we're looking at unhealthy conflict, we're looking at conflict that's kind of laced with anger, blame, manipulation, or even sometimes kind of avoidance of the problem altogether, right? So it's basically any of the stuff that we can think of when we get into an argument in our personal life that creates a lot of defensiveness, creates a lot of hurt feelings, that kind of stuff. So a lot of times that's what we look at when we view unhealthy conflict. On the reverse end of this, healthy conflict is going to be, there's a few different ways that we can tell a conflict is more healthy. So generally, the first thing we look at is the conflict focuses more on addressing the topic being disagreed on rather than the people in the conversation. We look at the emotional state of the people in the conversation. So if the conflict, both people in the conflict are relatively calm and addressing it in a respectful manner without demeaning or belittling the other person, that generally is more likely to be a healthy conversation. Okay. So basically, there's a few different types of unhealthy conflict that we'll see. Some of them are more obvious than others. And the first one I want to go over with you guys is one that I think gets looked at a little bit less often. And this is passive communication. So this is basically placing another person's wants, needs, or feelings above our own, and due to fear of upsetting the other person or fear of consequences towards us or our ability to work at our place of employment. And so the example I give here that's, I think, pretty common for a lot of people in kind of high achieving workplaces is Greg feels overworked but doesn't speak up about it. And so let's say you're getting a lot of new responsibilities placed on your plate. You're feeling like, okay, maybe I can handle them. This should be fine. But the more responsibilities you get, maybe the more overwhelmed you become. But you don't want to say anything because you don't want your boss to think negatively of you and kind of take some of that stuff away. Or you don't want them to get upset with you for that kind of stuff. So that's kind of like passive communication, which is essentially like where we're not talking about the issue at hand. And this can even look like if we know there is a conflict and there's a conflict we've had in the past, we tend to avoid that person and we tend to avoid that conflict as much as possible, even though it's still present and even though it's still causing an issue. So this is one that I think is talked about a little bit less often, but it can have just as much of a problem basically as the more aggressive style of unhealthy communication that we're going to be talking about in just a second here. Okay, so aggressive communication is generally the one that we're more familiar with. So this is the one that we view as basically yelling and screaming at the other person as the more severe examples, or more like vocal criticism through insults or passive aggressive comments or things of that nature. So it's basically kind of the more clear and obvious version of unhealthy communication. So it's basically like the example I give here is, so Don's the CEO of a company and high productivity numbers are very important to him for this company. And so he's been noticing lower productivity numbers over the past month or two, and it's been very frustrating for him. And so instead of kind of having a healthier communication with his staff about it, he goes into the next staff meeting and he starts yelling at people and throwing out insults due to his frustration over the low productivity numbers. So this is more of what we would consider to be aggressive communication. Okay, so now I want to quickly go into the topic of microaggressions. And so these are like everyday verbal, nonverbal, or environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to people based solely upon their marginalized group membership. And so some of these microaggressions can look a little more obvious than others. So that's why I thought it would be important to kind of go into them and talk about them a little bit, because sometimes we may be using some of these and we might not be aware of it. Okay, so the first one is going to be talking about microassaults. So these are some of the more obvious types of microaggressions that we'll see because they're basically intended verbal or nonverbal attacks against a marginalized individual. So this can be something like open racial slurs, or it can be intentionally ignoring the other person. So like if you have a staff meeting where like let's say this is a supervisor is bringing people in for a staff meeting and one particular staff member raises their hand and then another one raises their hand to talk about something and the supervisor completely ignores the original person that raised their hand first and goes right to the other person, or maybe the one individual staff member will speak up to try to say something and they just kind of completely move the conversation past that and ignore them. And so that's essentially the more obvious version of a microaggression, which is a micro assault. And
We pay $15 a month.
okay, and so then we'll go into what we call micro insults. And so micro insults are basically a way of insulting someone and their heritage through passive aggressive, impolite, or even insensitive comments. And so these can be comments that we see, such as kind of implying someone is very well spoken despite their race, or implying that someone only got their job due to company trying to reach some sort of a minority quota, so to speak. And so this is something that even though it's not a direct insult, it's more of kind of like a passive aggressive thing, or even somebody might have meant something as a compliment, but to the person receiving it, it felt more like kind of an insult because it's kind of insulting their race or overall, basically. And so lastly, we have micro invalidations. So micro invalidations aren't necessarily insults, but they're basically comments that nullify the thoughts or feelings of minority populations. So these are comments like, oh, I don't see color, I treat everyone equally, or I thought this was something that we don't have to deal with anymore in the past. And so things of that nature. So these are comments that, again, that may feel like we're trying to be supportive or that we're trying to be kind of helpful in a certain situation, but can actually come off differently than we intend. And so things to keep in mind and be careful. Okay, so for the people on the receiving end of microaggressions. So I just wanted to talk about some things of being able to, well, kind of like how to respond when we feel like we're receiving a microaggression in our direction. So first things first, and I think this one can be challenging because microaggressions are hurtful, is don't act in anger. So I think a lot of times when we're on the receiving end of a microaggression in whatever form it's going to be, our first response is we want to lash out. We want to get defensive, things of that nature. And I think the first thing, and we want to be careful of that, is even though we may be justified in that anger, at the same time, we want the other person to kind of see why we're upset. And generally, if we lash out in anger, the response will be defensiveness and the response will be equal or greater anger from that other person, which defeats the conversation entirely. Like we don't get what we're looking for in that at all. And so first thing is we don't want to act in anger when we're having these conversations and making these responses, right? And so then the next thing we want to look at is thinking about like whether we want to respond or not. So I had some clients that I worked with a few years ago before I was working at UF. One of them worked in the fast food industry, and they would get comments all the time that they felt were racially insensitive or something that was downright hurtful for them, and they were from customers. And more often than not, the client decided, hey, I'm just not going to respond to this. It's not really worth my time. I'm never going to see this person again. So I didn't really feel like it was worth it. However, while they were working in that particular environment, they also had a colleague or two that would also make similar comments. And so that felt like a different situation for them. Excuse me. Mainly because of the fact that they're like, hey, I'm around this person on a day-to-day basis. These comments aren't just one-offs. I hear them more often than I would like. And so in that particular situation, that client felt like it was more worth it to speak up because they're like, hey, this is something that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue for me. Okay. So then we're looking at a little bit of like, okay, when I want to have this conversation, how do I go into it? Like, what's the perspective I want to have? Like, what do I want to say? And so a lot of times, unless it's like a very overt micro assault, what we want to do is we want to go into this conversation with this perspective almost of kind of giving the other person who expressed the microaggression the benefit of the doubt. And we want to come into this with a positive attitude. And the reason that I talk about that is because I think a lot of times, like we were saying with don't act in anger, if we come into the conversation with like kind of a very like angry tone, or if we come into it with like a lot of blaming statements and things like that, like the person intended to use the microaggression, whether they did or not, generally what happens is we don't get the result that we're looking for. That person will generally become defensive, and then they won't hear anything that we have to say anymore because they're feeling like they have to defend themselves in their position. So a lot of times we want to come into it like they didn't mean to say whatever they said, even if they did. Because generally that's shown to kind of be more successful. And so moving down, kind of like what we were talking about before, we want to talk about the event and not the person. So we want to talk about the comment that was made or the situation that resulted in the comment. because generally if we're talking about the situation or the comment rather than the person, there's less likely the person is going to get defensive. And we're going to go into kind of how to do that and everything later on in the slides to kind of just give you, and that'll be kind of like one of our tools. And so basically, lastly, what we want to be doing is discuss how the event made us feel or the comment made us feel and what we would like to see in the future, see differently in the future. So kind of bringing up solutions, bringing up what would be helpful to us and what would make us like feel like we're not being mistreated, essentially. And so these are basically some of the ways we would respond if we felt like we were receiving a microaggression of some sort. Okay, so now after kind of talking about the different forms of unhealthy communication, I wanted to talk with you guys about healthy communication. What does that look like? What are some of the tools that we can use to kind of have a healthy conversation? And I have a few videos that I'll show you guys later on in the slides that'll also kind of give you some examples of what that looks like. And so basically, healthy communication is also going to be what we call assertive communication. So this is a type of communication where we're both standing up for ourselves and what we're wanting and how we're feeling, but we're also listening respectfully to the other person or multiple people in the conversation. And basically, the goal in a lot of these cases is to work towards compromise in a way where everyone is going to feel heard and respected and feels like they're getting some of their needs met. And so the example that I give here, so Natalie's a supervisor, and she notices one of her employees, Brett, is kind of falling behind on some of his paperwork. So she pulls him aside, and basically how she addresses that issue is like this. So she says, "Hey, Brett, I've been noticing that over the past couple of weeks, you've been falling behind on your paperwork. And I'm concerned that if this path continues, we won't be able to reach our deadline for A and B project. And I wanted to see if there was something going on. And I wanted to see if there was something that I can do to help because it's important that you're feeling good about the tasks that I've been giving you." And so that's kind of an example of our kind of assertive communication. And so how do we use this? And so I gave you guys an example, and so now I want to break it down for you a little bit. So basically the first way, so if we're expressing how we're feeling about a particular conversation or we're expressing a need, we want to use what we call I statements. So I statements are generally statements that are used to address how we're feeling about a situation without blaming the other person. So if Brett were responding to Natalie's concern, he would say, "I feel very overwhelmed with the number of responsibilities on my plate, and I would appreciate more help from you on some of these assignments." Or I would appreciate more help from someone else in some of these assignments. And so basically the structure of this form of a comment is, "I feel this way because of this, I need this." And so generally what we want to be careful of is we don't want to say some of the things that we don't need. We don't want to pile on the criticism, so to speak. Instead, we want to address like what we want that will hopefully help change the situation. And so the example video I'm going to give you here is these two are students at a college that were basically working on an assignment, and the assignment was kind of giving the difference between what we call I statements versus you statements. And so their video here is them, the first section of the video is them kind of coming in heated, like arguing with each other, throwing out you statements left and right. And so that's kind of showing the result of that is the conversation didn't end very well. And so the next part of the video is going to be them coming back in using I statements, and you guys will see the big difference there in kind of in how the conversation goes. And so I'm going to go ahead and play this for you guys.
No volume.
Okay, so that was our use statements, and you can kind of see there how he came in, he was immediately hot, and he was throwing out those you statements,
We
those
have no
blaming.
volume. We didn't hear any of it.
Oh, there's no volume on the video? Okay, 1 second. Let me see if I can fix that. Oh. Okay, so that is weird, but basically, go ahead and I'll give you guys a little bit of a summary of basically what they were doing in the video. So they were both supposed to be working on
Hi, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, we don't hear anything now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So basically, the summary of this video is going to be that they were originally working on a project together. One of them came in very heated, very upset that the other guy was not doing his fair share of the project. And so in response, the guy got naturally defensive and kind of went up and stormed out of the room, didn't hear what the original guy was trying to say at all. And so basically, the next part of this was him coming in and saying, "Hey, I've been noticing that I've been working on a lot of this project together, and I wanted to see what was going on for you because this isn't like you. We've worked together in the past. I know you're very on point with this a lot of times, so I wanted to see what was going on, if there was anything I can do to help." And so essentially, the main difference was he was coming in more with a concerned and calm and curious attitude rather than something that was very hostile and blaming. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next video. I want you guys to let me know if you can hear this one. Okay, so before that, we're going to go into reflective listening, though. And so reflective listening is going to be the other half of this coin for communication. So this is essentially the other person in the conversation that is listening to the speaker. Their job in the conversation is basically to reflect back what they heard the other person say. And generally, we're doing this in our own words. And so if Natalie was responding to Brett, our person from the earlier example, she would respond to his concerns with, "It sounds like you're having a difficult time keeping up with everything and would like me to assist you, would like me to kind of help you a little more with some of the tasks on your plate." And so then Brett would have the opportunity to say, hey, yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Or no, that's actually not what I meant. Here's what I meant. So basically, reflective listening is used for a few different things. We're using it to kind of show the other person that we're following them, that we hear what they're saying. And we're also using it to kind of help clarify, just in case maybe we are uncertain if we're hearing correctly what the other person is saying. So basically, I think this is probably an even more important part of communication than I statements, just because it's kind of showing that we're hearing the other person. It's moving the conversation forward, and it's kind of moving us closer to compromise in whatever form of issue that we're having. Okay, so now we're going to move on to this next video, and I hope this video will work. We will see. So let me know if you guys can or can't hear this. All right, can you guys hear that?
No.
No. Okay.
Did you
So,
share the sound? There's actually a setting that you need to click.
oh, okay, I did not know that. Yeah, so I can definitely do that. All right, let's go ahead and, oh, yep, share sound. Okay, let's see if that'll fix it.
Great.
We can hear it.
Awesome. Okay, so this is going to be an example of reflective listening here. Raymond, like everybody loves Raymond. Raymond is coming in to kind of show his wife how to use reflective listening with their young daughter. So this is kind of showing how this tool can be used with even little kids. So it's something that I think can be helpful especially in the workplace, because I think this kind of shows that we are able to just communicate more effectively. Okay.
This is Michael's giraffe. He's crying now. Why did you do this?
Cause.
Cause is not an answer.
Active listening.
Ray, that doesn't work.
It works. I just use it on the worst kids in the neighborhood.
Would you look at this? Look what she
Just
did.
try it. Try it.
No, Ray.
I'll
it's
do
a-
it. You want me to do it? I'll
No,
do
no,
it.
no, no. Okay. Ellie, let's talk about what you did.
I don't want to talk.
Are you feeling angry?
Reflect back.
You're angry.
Yes.
Okay. But it's not okay to rip up toys when we're angry.
Judgmental.
You are angry because
Because it used to be your toy.
oh,
Yes. I don't like Michael and Jeffrey.
I see. You think that Mommy and Daddy pay too much attention to Michael and Jeffrey.
Ray, okay, I was handling this.
They get everything.
Right, and you're upset because we gave them your old giraffe.
I still liked it.
But you weren't playing with it.
But that doesn't matter, though, because it was still yours. And you're mad because we gave it to Michael without asking you, right?
Right.
Well, Mommy and Daddy made a mistake. And everybody makes mistakes, right, Mommy?
Yes.
You feel better now, Allie?
Yes, can I have the giraffe?
Well, it's broken, honey.
I know, I want to try to fix it for Michael.
So if you guys see what he did here, he was basically reflecting back what he thought his daughter was feeling about them giving the giraffe over to one of their other children. And so essentially, this is an example of how we can kind of use some of these communication tools in our workplace environment as well. And so we're going to be doing it by kind of reflecting back content or feeling that we heard from the other person as kind of a way of just kind of checking in to make sure we're hearing them properly, to kind of show them that we're paying attention and that we're hearing them out, even if we don't necessarily agree. So I think this is one of the key things that I want to emphasize with reflective listening. We don't always have to agree with what the other person is saying, even if we're reflecting back what they heard. We just want to show them that we're paying attention, because if they feel like we're listening, they don't always need us to agree. They just want to know that we're listening. Okay, so now we're going to go on to talking about communicating with people who are neurodivergent. And so essentially, I want to go over a few different things in this. I want to go over what exactly is neurodivergence. I want to go over the difference between what it looks like to pay attention between what we call a neurotypical individual versus a neurodivergent person. Excuse me. And then I want to go into some of the tools we can use, or some of the thought processes that we can go through that can kind of help us to understand how to better communicate with somebody who is neurodivergent. And so what is neurodivergence? So this is basically a term that we use to describe when someone thinks, learns, or behaves differently than we would consider to be in the typical, right? So examples of people who have neurodivergent conditions can be people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, or any form of like auditory processing disorder, where even though you're talking to them and you're kind of trying to teach them something, they may need more than just kind of vocal speech alone to help it sink in. Okay, so difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent people. So generally, we as a society, I think, have some commonalities that we look for when we're looking for somebody that is paying attention to us versus not paying attention to us. So for neurotypical people, like everyday people, generally we feel like this can look like if somebody's paying attention to us, we look for appropriate eye contact. We look for them sitting still and not moving around a whole bunch. and we look for appropriate facial expressions based off of what's being discussed. For a neurodivergent person, however, this can look a little different. The nonverbals can be different from what we're expecting. And so if we were to look at a person with autism, for example, little eye contact or avoiding eye contact may not necessarily mean that the person isn't paying attention. In fact, like if they are looking at you, it may actually mean they're not hearing you in that moment. So if they're not looking at you, or they're kind of fidgeting back and forth or scrunching up their eyebrows and looking upward or things of that nature, that may mean they're also still paying attention, even if they're not doing the nonverbal cues that we're used to from someone. And another example I can give you guys of this too, I had a colleague that I worked with a few years ago. We actually went to school together for our master's program, and he had some pretty severe ADHD. And for some of our professors, like especially for the classes that were 3 hours or longer, he would go up to them and ask them, hey, can I pace in the back of the room? I'm still listening, but I just like after a certain amount of time, I need to get up and move. Otherwise, I have difficulty focusing, and it just gets very uncomfortable for me. So in his case, he'd be pacing back and forth in the back of the classroom, but he would still be listening to the professor speak. And so that's kind of some of the examples of how even though somebody may not look like they're paying attention, it doesn't mean they necessarily aren't paying attention. Okay, so how do we communicate with colleagues that we feel that have expressed to us are neurodivergent, or may not have expressed to us, but we have maybe an inkling that they're dealing with some of this stuff? So first things first, we want to check our assumptions. And those would be the assumptions we were talking about in the earlier slide of what it means when somebody isn't paying attention. Of course, there can still be some people that when they're not looking at you, that does mean they're not paying attention. But with somebody that's neurodivergent, that's not always the case. So we want to check those assumptions and make sure that we're kind of checking in with that person. The next thing is we don't want to attribute any negative traits we observe to a person's character. So just because somebody may look angry every time that we're interacting with them doesn't necessarily mean they are angry. And so next would be communicating clearly. So and I think this is something that can be challenging for a lot of us, because a lot of us may speak with some form of metaphor, or we may speak in what we think is very straightforward, but it might be a little vague, or we might use kind of a sarcastic joke to emphasize our point a little bit. And so when we're communicating with somebody who's neurodivergent, we want to avoid all of that. We want to speak very clearly and to the point, exactly what we're looking for, because that's generally the best way to kind of help a neurodivergent individual kind of understand what we're trying to get across to them. That's not always the case, but more often than not, keeping the communication clear is the most effective way of doing things. And then next thing is we want to be flexible. Like just because that one person is okay in the morning doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be continuing to be okay after that. One of the more common symptoms we'll see with somebody who's neurodivergent, especially somebody with autism or ADHD, is that things like bright lights or loud sounds for long periods of time can be very overstimulating. And so potentially if they are working in an office setting with very bright lights, that may kind of make things more stressful moving forward. So I think giving the benefit of the doubt with that person is helpful. And so lastly, we want to ask, how do people want to be communicated with? And I'll use myself as an example. So I'm a tactile learner. So I learn by doing things. And so generally, if people explain things to me, I'll be listening, I'll be taking notes. But in order for it to really sink in, I need kind of like hands-on learning to kind of know, okay, this is how I do things long term. And some people are like that. Some people are more visual. So they like seeing slides, they like seeing example videos, things of that nature. So I think asking how a person wants to be communicated with and how they learn best is very important. Okay, so moving on. Next thing is providing feedback to an employer or supervisor. This is a conversation that I have a lot in my office with clients, because it's something that I think is on a lot of people's minds, and it's something that I think we all struggle with in our job from time to time. And so I think it's important to know how to navigate those environments. So I think first things first, we want to pick an appropriate time to talk. And so by appropriate, I mean like, okay, a time and a situation and a place where we feel like the conversation is going to turn out best. And so sometimes this will happen, and I think this is a very poor time to talk, is kind of bringing up negative feedback in the middle of a staff meeting, right? So whether you're an employee giving feedback to your supervisor about something you didn't like that they did or something that they said, or if you're a supervisor trying to give feedback to one of your employees in the staff meeting, we don't want to do it with an audience present. And the reason we don't want to do it with an audience present is because people are going to feel more self-conscious, or people may feel embarrassed. And their listening brains aren't going to be open at that point. Their defensive brains are going to be in full effect, and they're not going to hear anything that you said. And that may create a worse conflict than may have resulted if we just kind of pulled them aside. So instead, what we want to do, we want to reach out to that person, and we want to say, hey, there are some things I want to talk with you about A, B, and C. Do you have a moment later today? Or do you have some time to talk, and kind of giving them the opportunity to kind of give you the time that they have available to talk. And then when you are doing that, you want it to be private. You want it to be behind closed doors, where it's other people aren't able to really listen in, and other people aren't present. And so that's the first thing when we're giving feedback to someone. The next thing we want to do is plan what we want to say. So generally, when something upsets us, our first reaction is to kind of say whatever's on our mind, regardless of how hurtful, regardless of how unhelpful it is. But instead, we want to hold that reaction. And instead, if we feel like we're going to have that reaction, if we kind of go into the conversation at that point, we want to hold off on it. Even if we're in an appropriate space where we've scheduled the time, we're behind closed doors, it's private. We want to plan out how we want to say things, particularly with using our I statements, with using our reflective statements, because I think those are going to be the most helpful. And so then, as we've said in other slides, we want to focus on the issue and not the person. So if you feel like you're getting too much on your plate, or if you feel like some things that your supervisor kind of may have said to you are confusing, or something along those lines, we want to focus on the fact that that particular comment was confusing, or we want to focus on the fact that the workload is too high. And we don't want to kind of make comments on the person or their managing style or on their way of doing the job. We want to focus on the issue. And so lastly, we want to share what we think would be helpful to see kind of differently. So instead of the workload you have now, how could you distribute that to be more successful? Or instead of explaining things in one particular way, how could your supervisor explain things in a different way that may make it easier for you to understand? Things of that nature. So I think these are some common things we can do to kind of help improve communication about things we don't like with both our employees and our supervisor. Okay, so lastly, how do we know when to communicate? So I know this can be challenging at times when we're very heated. We want to talk about something. We want to get our point across that we're hurt. But that's not always the best time to communicate. And I think it can be difficult to tell when the best time to communicate is. So our body has a good way of kind of letting us know that. So if we're feeling muscle tension, or increased heart rate, or increased body temperature, or anything like that, that's our body's way of kind of telling us we may be entering into what we call our fight or flight response. So when we're in fight or flight, we probably don't want to be having those conversations at that point, because they're not going to be very helpful for us at that time. So instead, we want to kind of self-regulate through some of these different tools. And so I go over some of these with clients. We deep breathing strategies, progressive muscle relaxation, where we're kind of clenching and unclenching different parts of our body to release tension. The 5-4-3-2-1 technique, which is kind of like a grounding technique that places us in the present moment rather than somewhere else in our mind where we're kind of thinking about the problem. And there are other things people use as well. There are other things that everybody finds helpful. And so I think overall, we want to do whatever we can to regulate our emotions before we come in and have that conversation. Because if our emotions are elevated and we're feeling like we're in rough shape, we're not going to have the best form of conversation. Okay, so what do we do if these techniques don't work? This is also another issue that I'll have come in from time to time for clients, where they've said they've tried some of these tools from past therapists they've seen or some of their research, and it just hasn't worked because the other person still isn't wanting to communicate in that way, or there is a lot of defensiveness there that you can kind of see. And so if that's the case, if you're trying your best to communicate and it's just not working, here are some of the things that you can do next. So if it's between employees, between colleagues, we would go to our supervisor at that point. If you've tried to talk to your colleague about the particular issue you're having and they're not playing ball, then we want to go to our supervisor to see if they can help to mediate the situation. If it's a conflict between an employee and a supervisor, then we want to go potentially to the next person above that supervisor at that point to see if they can help us mediate the conversation and come to some form of a compromise. And so if none of this is working, or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, employee relations or the university ombudsman is a good place to go, just because of the fact that part of their job is to help investigate any form of conflict in the workplace and to kind of help all parties kind of mediate the conflict to the best of their abilities. Sometimes even with the ombudsman, he'll come in and he'll sit down in a room, meet with all parties, and be kind of an unbiased third party to be able to kind of help more effectively mediate some of these conversations and conflicts. And lastly, you guys are always welcome to come see us over at the Employee Assistance Program to kind of learn some of these tools in a more individualized fashion, or just to kind of have somebody to vent to and talk about kind of next steps. And so those are some of the things you can do if some of these techniques aren't working for you with the particular problem that you're having. Okay, so now we're going to get to questions here.